One of the questions we're commonly asked is, what are some of the common deficiencies you're identifying? When you're focused on developing your own AML program, it isn't always easy to step back and identify the broader gaps or themes. So today we'd like to share some of those observations with you. Assi and I will walk you through some of the most common deficiencies we've identified across AML programs, with particular focus on risk assessment, ongoing monitoring, training, the application of policies and procedures, and effectiveness reviews. These aren't issues that we see in every organization. Rather, they are recurring themes we've identified through our supervisory work across different reporting entities. Our hope is that as we go through today's presentation, you will gain practical insights that you can apply within your own AML framework as you continue to evolve and strengthen your program. As you know, all reporting entities are required to conduct a risk assessment to identify and understand their exposure to money laundering and terrorist financing risks. When we talk about a risk-based program, and a risk-based approach, we're really talking about understanding where the greatest risks exist so you can make informed decisions about your program. Your risk assessment should help you identify the highest areas of your program, the highest areas of risk, so you can determine where to apply enhanced measures, and also to ensure that they're proportionate to the risks that you've identified. A strong risk assessment isn't just about identifying risks. It's about understanding those risks, applying appropriate measures to manage and mitigate them, and making sure your program continues to reflect evolving risk profiles. What we found is that most reporting entities understand the requirements. The challenge isn't usually understanding what's required, it's applying those requirements consistently in practice. So I'd like to walk you through some of the more common themes that we've identified. The first area I'd like to touch on is the client risk assessment methodology because it's a gap we commonly see. Most reporting entities have a methodology for assessing the prescribed risk factors, such as customer type, products and services, geographic exposure, and delivery channels. One of the things we look for is whether the methodology is being applied consistently and whether the resulting risk ratings are supported by the information available. If we see similar clients receiving different risk ratings, what we'd expect to see is a clearly documented rationale explaining why. What we commonly find is that the rationale isn't always clearly reflected in the file. And without that documentation, it can become difficult for you to demonstrate that the methodology is being applied consistently. Another deficiency we commonly see is sector-specific risk factors being applied inconsistently. Depending on the nature of the reporting entity, this may include factors such as correspondent banking relationships, cash-intensive activities, international wire activities. If those factors aren't appropriately reflected in the methodology, the resulting risk rating may not accurately represent the client's inherent risk. The next area I'd like to touch on is how prescribed risk factors are translated into practice. While reporting entities often identify the prescribed risk factors within their policies and procedures, what we'd expect to see is clear guidance on how those factors should be assessed and how they influence the overall risk rating. What we commonly find is that that guidance isn't always clear or consistently applied. An effective assessment doesn't stop at identifying risk. A key step is determining what measures are needed to manage and mitigate those risks. What we'd expect to see is that the risks identified inform the measures that are put in place, whether that's enhanced due diligence, more frequent periodic reviews, or more focused transaction monitoring. If those identified risks aren't reflected in those downstream measures, the value of the risk assessment is significantly reduced. Identifying the risks, as we said, it's really the first step, it's just the first step. The next question is, what does that mean for my program? Does it change how often a client should be reviewed? Does it change how monitoring is applied? That's where the assessment starts adding real value. Another area I'd like to touch on is how organizations respond to emerging risks. FINTRAC publications, advisories, and indicators relating to MLTF and sanctions evasion typologies aren't always incorporated into policies and procedures or risk assessments in a timely way. One of the contributing factors we sometimes see is the responsibility for monitoring those changes and ensuring they're incorporated into the program isn't always clearly defined. New risks emerge, products and services change, customer relationships evolve. What we'd expect to see is organizations periodically stepping back to make sure their risk assessment continues to reflect the current risk environment. Before moving on, it's helpful to distinguish between inherent and residual risk. Inherent risk is the level of risk before the controls are applied, while residual risk is the level of risk that remains after those controls are in place. What we commonly find is that while both are addressed, the rationale supporting how controls reduce inherent risk isn't always well documented. Without that supporting rationale, it can become difficult to understand how the residual risk rating was determined. A strong risk assessment isn't just about identifying risks, it's about understanding the risks, applying appropriate measures to mitigate and manage those risks, and making sure that your program continues to reflect your risk profile. Some best practices that we can share to help strengthen your risk assessment: use FINTRAC's guidance, operational briefs, and alerts to help you identify and understand your MLTF exposure. Periodically reviewing and updating your risk assessment to reflect emerging typologies and changes within your business. Clearly documenting the rationale supporting risk ratings and any changes to those ratings. And to help you understand the inherent risks of your client base, we encourage you to refer to Canada's National Inherent Risk Assessment. Once a reporting entity has assessed its risks, ongoing monitoring helps to ensure that any new changes in a client's risk profile are identified and, where appropriate, reflected in the client's risk assessment. As you know, reporting entities are required to review information obtained about their clients through the business relationship, with the frequency of those reviews reflecting the client's level of risk. What we'd expect to see is that those monitoring activities help reporting entities identify meaningful changes over time so they can determine whether additional measures may be appropriate and whether the client's risk assessment continues to reflect the client's current level of risk. What we found is most reporting entities understand the requirements. The challenge isn't usually understanding what's required, it's applying those requirements consistently in practice. So I'd like to walk you through some of the more common themes we've identified. The first area I'd like to touch on is higher risk clients, because it's something we commonly see. Periodic reviews for higher risk clients don't always provide the necessary depth of analysis that we expect. Rather than reassessing whether a client's risk profile has changed, reviews sometimes focus primarily on confirming information that's already on file. One of the things we look for is whether the results of the ongoing monitoring are being considered as part of the client's overall risk assessment. If unusual activity is identified or new information becomes available, what we'd expect to see is that the information being considered to determine whether the client's risk rating remains appropriate. What we commonly find is that changes identified through ongoing monitoring aren't always reflected in the client's risk assessment where appropriate. The next area I'd like to touch on is low to medium risk clients. For low and medium risk clients, reviews can sometimes be more administrative than risk-based, like a checkbox activity. What we'd expect to see instead is those reviews considering whether the client's activities, products and services, or other risk factors have changed since the previous assessment. Another gap we commonly see is that the trigger events aren't always identified or acted upon consistently. And as a result, low and medium risk clients may not always be reviewed in a timely manner to determine whether their risk profile has changed. Where that happens, their risk assessment may no longer reflect the current level of risk. Another area I'd like to touch on is documentation. One of the things we look for is clear documentation supporting the review that was completed. What we'd expect to see is sufficient documentation to explain what was reviewed, what was considered, and how the reviewer arrived at that conclusion. However, what we commonly find is that the rationale supporting those conclusions isn't always clearly documented. What we find is that reporting entities with stronger practices in this area tend to do a few things consistently. They align the frequency of their reviews with the client's level of risk. They ensure changes identified through ongoing monitoring are reflected in the client's risk assessment where appropriate. And they periodically review their monitoring processes to make sure that they continue to reflect their current risk environment. Ultimately, effective ongoing monitoring is about understanding your clients over the course of the business relationship, identifying meaningful changes when they occur, and making sure your monitoring activities continue to reflect those changes. For ongoing monitoring, some additional best practices include developing a review schedule that aligns with your identified risks. Ensure your transaction monitoring processes, whether they're automated or manual, that they're adequately aligned to your risk assessment and risk exposure. Regularly review transaction monitoring rules and scenarios to ensure that they remain appropriate and effective and that you have adequate coverage. Prioritize the review and investigations of higher risk alerts. And with that, I'll hand it over to Asya, who will take you through the next session of today's presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all of you for continuing to stay on top of all of our compliance program requirements and trends observed. So I will take you through the specialized training program, the policies and procedure application, and the 2-year effectiveness review requirements. So in terms of the specialized training program and plan, I think before I get into the specific details, I do want to emphasize that overall, from a foundational training enterprise-wide program perspective, we do see most reporting entities understanding the need for enterprise-wide training, making sure the core obligations of what a training program should look like, and making sure it's clearly designed and operating effectively is an area of strength for most reporting entities. So what I mean by this regard is generally from a broad compliance program perspective, we see evidence of KYC training, of beneficial ownership training, what is a risk assessment training, and any other reporting obligations such as when to file an LCTR, EFT, STR, etc. So most of those foundational pillars is something that we do consistently see across the board for most reporting entities. So what I'm focusing on for today is an area of improvement that we have identified for the need to enhance the specialized training program and plan. So in terms of what is the trend across the majority of the sectors that we supervise is the strength of the program really does have an impact on not just relying on the generic or general AML ATF program training, but really focusing on the specific needs and units of your organization. So if your business is, through the risk assessment exercise, have been foundationally, involved in mitigating a specific risk relating to a specific product or service or delivery channel, or if your business is relying on agents, mandatories, various branches to do a lot of the frontline operation duties, we do recommend that your specialized training program is evolving to meet the needs of the enterprise-wide goals and obligations. So what we would see from an effective training program and plan is that an assessment needs is conducted across the organization. The training program and the specialized training program needs is not just centered towards AML-centric team, because really the whole organization should be accountable for understanding what their obligations are from a frontline perspective, from an agent perspective, from a branch perspective, and understanding what the specialized MLTF trend that can occur within your organization is crucial to developing a specialized training program and plan. So for example, if your business is involved in, facilitating commercial activity or activity that involves trading of various products and services, then perhaps you want to focus your specialized training program to ensure that sanctions evasion indicators are effectively applied and understood. You also want to make sure trade-based money laundering indicators are effectively not just documented, but making sure they're effectively working and applied consistently across your organization. You also want to make sure that you have a good understanding of all of your client interfaces and needs and with the products of your organization. So if your organization focuses on non-face-to-face channels as a primary mechanism for facilitating and monitoring, the business activities of your clients and business relationships, then making sure that you have the appropriate automated and or manual interventions to be able to capture some of the MLTF risks and vulnerabilities across your specialized training program and plan. A foundational pillar that we do want to see consistently across our regulated entities is the need to test your program in its entirety, but specifically focusing on whether or not your specialized training program is operating as intended. And it shouldn't be an exercise that is conducted infrequently. In fact, as new regulations come into force and as you onboard, a new client type, a new product, a new delivery mechanism, we do expect that you train your staff, you train your operations that are impacted, and that your risk exposure is adequately mitigated as a result. And so the impact with not maintaining an appropriate specialized training program and plan is that your ongoing monitoring reviews may be ineffective or inefficient in addressing any emerging MLTF risk or vulnerability. It can have an impact on the quality of your investigations or your teams that are accountable for identifying red flags, whether it's for sanctions reporting or suspicious transaction reporting or even electronic fund transfer reporting. All of that and all of the regime reporting requirements do play a role together in making sure that we maintain an effective Canadian regime. And so, all of these areas may increase your risk to not really addressing the emerging threat or vulnerability that is facing your business. So adjusting your training program as needed in a timely manner and not waiting an extensive period of time. So for example, the legislative requirement for the 2-year review is every 2 years, but, really applying those effectiveness of controls more consistently and more effectively within the 2-year period could help you mitigate some of this risk. Now I will turn my attention to the application of policies and procedures. So again, we do want to emphasize this is not an application issue across all of the reporting entities that we see, but we did want to focus on a couple of different observation or trends that we have seen over the last year or so impacting businesses. So while having a well-documented framework is foundational, it's important, it's relevant, really their value is consistent on day-to-day implementation. Effective application of your policies and procedures really make sure that all of your staff and your business lines are understanding and are able to follow your policies and procedures that have been developed and approved by a senior officer or a chief compliance officer. And it really helps to support your overall program health and integrity. To this end, all reporting entities should be aware of new compliance program requirements as they become in effect. So for example, to illustrate today's session, we did bring up the sanctions evasion indicators. Really, there's also extortion red flag indicators. So as new indicators become, pertinent on public websites, we do expect that there is a mechanism or a process in place to make sure that you update on an ad hoc basis your frameworks, your compliance program requirements, and not waiting for a special frequency if it doesn't make sense necessarily. Having the appropriate testing frameworks and self-assessment of controls will provide an overview as to whether or not the design of your program is still working as intended. And what we mean by that is, again, you shouldn't be finding out 2 years from now when your audit program is identifying certain risks or vulnerabilities. It should be an ongoing process that you've instituted to make sure that our staff still understanding your procedures. Maybe they were good at a point in time, but now new staff have emerged, and you may have an employee turnover, and maybe the procedures that used to exist no longer are effective, or they're no longer understood to the same way that you thought they would. So again, to this end, making sure that you're testing, you have oversight, you have proper mechanisms to identify these trends will be crucial for your success. In terms of what we see for the sanctions evasion related indicators throughout our assessment activities, we do still see outdated policies and procedures that relate to historical reporting requirements. It's not often, but it's still observed. So just to make it aware for everyone, the need to file a terrorist property report is no longer in effect. The legislative obligations have changed, and we've introduced the licensed person's entity property report obligations. So again, making sure that you're up to date. FINTRAC has published extensive guidance in this regard. So if you're not aware, please go on our website and you can see a list of all publications impacting this very important requirement. And really the one thing to note here is, unlike other report types, this report is still to be submitted not electronically, rather through mail or fax. So just make note of that and make sure you're aligning your timelines associated with that as a result. In terms of what we see in our examination practices, we have seen that there's still unclear application of when to file an STR versus the LPEPR report requirements. So again, making sure your staff are fully up to speed on when these obligations apply and how to apply them in practice, and what sources of information they need to consult to make sure that the risks are understood, and that the timing requirements are also understood for STR reporting versus the LPEPR reporting, and when those obligations get triggered, which is vastly different depending on the report type that you're looking at. So some firms are still looking at outdated sanctions guidance or outdated list. So we do welcome you to consult FINTRAC's website for an up-to-date link of all the publications required for REs to consult to comply with the sanctions regulations. And in terms of escalation practices or decision frameworks, depending on how large your organization is, it is important to double check that all of your job aids and your workflows are updated, that if you rely or are heavily dependent on other teams and units and functions to do a wide variety of reporting, that all the teams are talking to one another. There is a handoff procedure in place that helps you know when you filed an LPEPR report versus an STR versus an EFT, and that it also works together with your risk assessment of your clients and business relationships. And sometimes we do see that misalignment where one team performs a job or a function and the other team doesn't have awareness or visibility into that program. So where it makes sense and where there is that need for alignment to occur, please make sure that you have the overflows and the testing of frameworks in place to identify if these processes aren't being consistently applied. In terms of the policies and procedures and the 2-year review effectiveness requirement, so as I mentioned briefly just a moment ago, there is a requirement legislatively that you must do a review every 2 years, depending on the large and scale of your business operations. We would welcome you to reevaluate whether the 2-year prescribed frequency is effective. And what this means is if you have an additional risk that has occurred, for example, if you filed a voluntary disclosure of noncompliance to FINTRAC, and therefore you have found a remediation program that makes sense to remediate the voluntary disclosure of noncompliance, you may wish to add an extra ad hoc effectiveness review. That's not an entire review of your AML ATF program, but really it's meant to address that the program is still healthy and working as intended, and that you can mitigate any future repeat trends to occur on something that you've already disclosed as an area of noncompliance. Another area that you may want to look at is, regardless of who performs your effectiveness review, whether you rely on your internal audit function or whether you hire an external audit function, you have to be able to understand the scope of the review, the methodology, and the elements that were assessed and why. During compliance examinations, we do often see instances where AML reviews are approached differently than other regulatory reviews, with a more focus on documenting controls rather than demonstrating outcomes such as effectiveness. So where you would be able to provide an effective overview and have the appropriate mechanisms for identifying whether your audit has in fact caught all of the areas that perhaps require additional improvements or enhancements is you would see reviews that are able to demonstrate not that your policies and procedures exist, so the presence of controls, rather they look at assessing how those controls are effectively working in mitigating, detecting, and assessing real world scenario risks, so the effectiveness of controls. So depending on your organization size and scale, we have seen programs that create a cycle. So within a 2-year review, you may wish to focus half of your compliance program requirement testing in year 1, and then, in year 2, you move forward in assessing the other areas that have not been tested as of yet. But within that program, if there's additional risks that you think may warrant an ad hoc review, we do welcome and would be very pleased to see outcomes of those testing results during a compliance exam, for example. So in terms of testing, we did want to spend some time focusing on what is the difference between presence-based testing and effectiveness-based testing. And really what the goal of sharing insights with you in this regard is, within an audit program, it is very common that we will see certain compliance program requirements tested from a presence perspective. So again, looking at the documents, does everything work as intended from a documentation perspective? But where you can take your testing program to an elevated way is assessing whether or not the actual process design is operating effectively. And that is different than assessing whether or not your actual process has been applied in practice. Because if your process in the way it was designed is perhaps not fully addressing the risk or the vulnerability, then whether or not your staff are applying that process and testing the output of that does not fully address your MLTF risk exposure. So where we've seen audit programs that take it to the next level is where they're challenging the business, challenging the compliance officers in terms of, is this the process design that you were hoping to achieve? Because perhaps there's a better way of doing it. We also see examples where testing is narrow in scope, so there would be limited coverage across client types, products, or risk levels. So again, a risk-based program would look at the highest risks of the organization, making sure those are effectively mitigated from a reporting, a risk assessment, and from a client onboarding KYC perspective, but then also making sure that, staff or, with the resources that you have, that really employees are focusing their energy on the biggest risks facing the organization. We do see sometimes gaps in the overall end-to-end effectiveness testing where key transitions between onboarding, monitoring, investigations, and or reporting are not fully assessed. So this increases the risk of breakdowns and your control frameworks. So ways to mitigate all these risks, maintaining a clear, well-documented analysis, which includes, having access to working papers, making sure the design testing is risk-based, and ensuring your remediation is being tracked and validated will all help you ensure that you stay on track and effectively risk manage your program effectively. And maybe before we close it off, today's session on compliance program trends and observations, we wanted to share with you some of our key takeaways. So I know what we gave you all is a lot to digest and a lot to take in, but really my overall key message for all of you today is really look beyond just the documentation, the checkbox approach to compliance, and really focus your energy on testing the effectiveness of your program, making sure it's risk-based, focusing your energy on the highest risks of your organization, and making sure your employees across your organization are well equipped in mitigating and understanding the increasing complexity of money laundering, terrorist financing, and sanctions evasion. Anik?
Thank you, Essia. You covered that well. I would say as we wrap up here, there are really three key messages I'd like to share with you today. First, take a genuinely risk-based approach. We've talked a lot about that, but your risk assessment really should help you understand where your greatest risks are, identify the highest risk areas of your program, determine what enhanced measures are needed, and ensure that the measures you've put in place are proportionate to the risks you've identified. Secondly, I would say consistent application matters. Throughout today's presentation, we've talked about risk assessments, ongoing monitoring, documentation. Having those processes in place is important, but what we'd expect to see in a mature program is that they're applied consistently in practice and supported by clear rationale. And finally, further to what Assia was saying through her portion of the presentation, keep your program current. Periodically reviewing your program helps to ensure it continues to reflect your current risk environment and that your controls remain proportionate again to the risks that you've identified. So with that, I'll say that we hope today's discussion has given you some practical information that you can take back to your own organizations. Thank you very much for your time, your engagement, and I will pass it over to Philippe.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you, Assia. I know this information, first of all, a lot of information is very useful for all businesses at all levels of maturity. So don't worry. Like I said at the beginning, those presentations will be shared. So you'll have these tip sheets just on the side of your desk for reference for future purposes. Like our agenda said, we'll take a short pause, take this time to catch up on emails, stretch your legs, get a cup of coffee. For time's sake, we'll restart at 2:30. So I think we still have some time. It is 2:10 Eastern time, so 2:30 our time is when we will restart the session, and we'll be hearing from our friends in the intelligence sector. So with that, please go and grab some refreshment drinks. It's pretty hot here on Eastern Canada, and we'll see you back at 2:30.